12,000 years ago, nature released the Earth from the grip of an ice age. Since then, we have tamed the wilderness, pioneered technologies, and as our numbers multiplied, built cities, nations, and empires. No part of the world has been left untouched. As scientists race to understand the huge impact we have on our planet, they have opened an astonishing new window on our past. Human history is a product of its environment. "3,200 years ago, humanity suffered one of the biggest setbacks in history.
It's like you hit the reset button on human civilization in the West.
Thriving cultures vanished within the span of a single human life amid waves of violent destruction.
The amount of things that we lost is just amazing.
The complete collapse of multiple societies at the same times means that writing systems go extinct, languages go extinct.
Now, explosive new data collected by scientists across the globe has blown open the mystery of the Bronze Age collapse, revealing how climate change has driven our past just as much as it will drive our future.
Good. Thanks for coming today. Looking forward to this.
Eric Klein is one of the world's leading authorities on the late Bronze Age.
It's the greatest period in history that nobody's ever heard of. This is a period that matters. This is the time period of the Exodus. This is the time period of the Trojan War, if either of those events happened.
The late Bronze Age was a period of flourishing kingdoms and empires, some of them with roots going back 2 millennia. But when the end came, it came fast.
Within a generation or two, everything that they had known and had been enjoying for centuries suddenly went away.
Why did so many of the first great civilizations collapse at the same time?
Archaeologists and ancient historians have been trying to figure out what caused the collapse for more than a century.
It's a question that Eric Klein set out to answer by piecing together evidence gathered from many quarters.
I was studying both Greece and the entire Near East, including Egypt. And I thought, oh, good, I've got a new worldview and I can see overall patterns and all that. Little did I realize that I was still siloed and compartmentalized within archaeology, within ancient history. When I went to conferences where geologists were presenting papers and where climate scientists were presenting papers, I suddenly realized we've actually been working in parallel without ever talking to each other.
But now this collision of history, archaeology, and the sciences is revolutionizing the questions we can ask about the past.
From my point of view, a whole nother world opened up. All of this is helping us to rewrite history as we know it.
Until now, the key evidence for how the collapse of Bronze Age civilization happened was handed down to us by the great survivor of these events. Egypt. This extraordinary kingdom had endured for over 2,000 years when disaster struck. The last few centuries had been good to Egypt. This was the era of famous pharaohs like Akhenaten, of his wife Nefertiti, of Tutankhamun, and Ramses the Great. Now another Ramses is on the throne. He has guided Egypt for 30 years.
Rameses III reigned at a time when Egypt was powerful, wealthy. It was in control of people not only in its own country but beyond as well.
On the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu in Thebes, Ramses recorded his achievements as pharaoh for posterity. And this record is contemporary evidence for the Bronze Age world's descent into war and chaos.
I think it's fair to say that Rameses III's reign was a very eventful one. And this is a time when things seem to have been beginning to change for the worse.
Ramses' monumental temple gave early archaeologists a vivid clue about the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. Inscriptions of the first years of his reign tell of marauders laying waste to cities and kingdoms, heading for Egypt.
It's survived, fortunately for us, incredibly well. It's decorated with scenes of Pharaoh in battle. We know from various different sources that in fact these weren't all campaigns fought on foreign soil. In other words, Egypt was being invaded.
This isn't something that Egypt often had to deal with. Beyond her borders was a network of kingdoms and empires. In modern-day Iraq were the Babylonians and Assyrians. Along the shores of Israel, Lebanon and Syria was the land of Canaan. In central Turkey was the capital of another mighty empire, the Hittites. Along the Turkish shores were many cities and kingdoms, such as Troy. And across the Aegean Sea was the Mycenean civilization of mainland Greece. But Egypt was the leading power of the day.
And these people, of course, also would have viewed Pharaoh as being an incredibly powerful individual with influence over their lives. So people all around the ancient world, all around the Mediterranean world, would have seen Egypt and Pharaoh as the great power.
Egypt's success story stretched far back in time to the very beginning of civilization. The product of the Nile River, flowing out of the heart of Africa to where Ramses' ancestors turned its unique properties into food and wealth. Astrobiologist Lewis Dartnell has written extensively on the origins of human civilization.
These primary civilizations that emerged first in our history are on the banks of major rivers. The Indus, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile River Valley. These are where we see the earliest civilizations on the planet, and then civilizations spread from those points of origin around the world.
But now it's believed that climate change played a key role by driving people towards the Nile Valley, where they settled down.
The region in North Africa that today we call the Sahara was once much wetter. It was swaying grasslands, dotted with lakes. It was a great environment for hunter-gatherers. But then, with a shift in Earth's climate, North Africa began to dry out, and the Sahara Desert emerged. Desertification of the Sahara region, this is believed to be one of the drivers that ended up in the emergence of dense settlements and civilization along the banks of the Nile.
By 3000 BCE, the settlements along the Nile Valley were united into one kingdom. So successful, it would produce the pyramids, an awe-inspiring symbol of the scale on which Egypt's early kings could harness labour and resources. And Egypt had the wealth to bring in anything that couldn't be found locally. A lively trade went on along the coasts of the Mediterranean. But the trade winds could also blow in unwelcome visitors. In the years around 1200 BCE, a succession of marauders were heading for the Nile Delta. The first attacks were in the reign of Pharaoh Meneptah 30 years earlier, but by Ramses' time things are clearly much more serious. Egyptian accounts tell us these invaders have already devastated many lands and cities. And sure enough, everywhere that archaeologists look, they find cities destroyed, burned, abandoned, from Greece and the Aegean to Turkey and Syria. It's as if the lights were going out all over the civilized world. So when Victorian archaeologists deciphered the inscriptions at Ramses' mortuary temple, they thought the pharaoh had identified the most likely suspects for causing the collapse of civilizations. They called them the Sea Peoples.
The name Sea People itself is a reflection of how little information we have even now about who they were. And it may well have been that Ramses III was somewhat in the dark about who he was facing.
The Sea Peoples were now the prime suspect in the violent end of an era. The Bronze Age catastrophe was a classic case of barbarians at the gates.
Over time, people's ideas started to morph and change a little bit. And in the very recent past, we've started to think that maybe they were just part of a much larger problem. And that while they are in there, while they are a factor, I don't think that they are any longer the only factor.
So what was really going on? Archaeologists began to look for a deeper set of causes behind the collapse, and that meant understanding what had happened in the world beyond Egypt's borders, where once successful kingdoms and cultures had been consumed by fire and destruction. One thing that seemed obvious to Eric Klein was that the kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age were all connected. While relations were not always peaceful, they probably spent more energy in trade and diplomacy than they did on war with one another.
The evidence that we've got for the interconnectedness in the Late Bronze Age is many and varied. They are writing back and forth to each other. They are keeping lists of the goods going back and forth. They are recording their diplomatic treaties. This is a period during which everyone is writing, so we've got the benefit of having those texts. We also have the benefit of the archaeology. That is, we've found the material culture at sites ranging from Megiddo to Hatzor to Mycenae to Knossos to Thebes to Hattusa. We are finding the actual objects that are being traded and exchanged.
Many of these distinctively shaped copper ingots have been recovered from the wrecks of Bronze Age merchant ships. As the key component in bronze, copper was a vital commodity, but it wasn't easy to find.
Copper is released in hydrothermal vents on the very deep seafloor, in the middle of the ocean. And so you've got to have a particular geological process that scoops up that deep oceanic crust and dollops it on top of the land where ancient miners can get at.
The Mediterranean island of Cyprus was a key centre of the copper trade. Cyprus even gave its name to the metal. The Mediterranean's restless geology made a sweet spot of the Troodos Mountains. The first miners excavated here 6,000 years ago. The scars still left on the landscape show archaeometallurgist Vasiliki Kassianidou why Cyprus powered Bronze Age civilizations.
Geological studies have shown that the Rhodos mountain range was formed when the Eurasian tectonic plate and the African tectonic plate moved away from each other. Magma came out of this rift and Rhodos was born. Then the two tectonic plates came together and lifted Rhodos to the surface. So we are standing on a piece of the ocean crust.
These Bronze Age tunnels cut into the mountains may have been rich in copper, but to make the metal that gave the Bronze Age its name, a much rarer metal was needed: tin.
Tin is not available in Cyprus. We know from the ancient sources that tin comes from the east, and we know from modern geological studies that in Afghanistan there are rich tin deposits. If you put this all together, it shows how everybody was interlinked and participating in a very complex trading network that brought these two metals that were needed for the society of that time.
This network was the lifeblood of Bronze Age civilization in the Mediterranean. The trade in metals and luxury goods played out against a background of diplomatic exchanges, dynastic marriages, and power plays between rival empires over control of lesser kingdoms. But at the end of the late Bronze Age, the system completely unravelled for everybody at the same time.
So I can give you a good example of just how catastrophic the collapse was. The Hittites in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. This civilization that had been on a par with the Egyptians as the two biggest names in the late Bronze Age was gone so completely that we had no idea where they were until the early years of the 1900s.
The theories for how this system broke down with such catastrophic consequences range from earthquake swarms in the Aegean to changes in warfare and famine. But Mediterranean civilizations had bounced back from all of these before.
Yes, there's information about earthquakes. Yes, for invaders. Yes, for drought. Yes, for famine. But each of them is a problem. That even if you have a drought, it doesn't usually kill everybody. Even if you've got a famine, it doesn't usually kill everybody. And then started thinking, what if you've got more than one? What if there's just too much to survive? And that was where I suddenly was thinking, maybe it's everything. It really was, I think, a perfect storm of catastrophes.
But just as Eric was formulating his theory, new scientific evidence was unearthed by the Exact Sciences team at the University of Tel Aviv. They were pioneering a new technique for reconstructing the past: counting pollen grains. Here at the Dead Sea in southern Israel, Daphne Langut made a revolutionary discovery in a layer cake of ancient sediments that offered evidence of a very different past.
The Dead Sea Lake once had much higher lake levels. For researchers like me, this is kind of a heaven, because I can come to this beautiful sediment outcrop and I can look at the laminated section and I can understand that the place that I am sampling at that moment used to be part of the Dead Sea Lake.
Hidden in the highly saline sediments are microscopic pollen grains that have been preserved for millennia.
Each plant species produces its own unique pollen form that later can be identified under the microscope. It's like its identity card. And I'm fascinated by the fact that these tiny microscopic grains can tell us fascinating information about past vegetation and climate changes.
Daphne uses radiocarbon dating to find out when the pollen was laid down on the lake bed. But around the time of the Bronze Age collapse, she saw an astonishing change in the lake itself.
When you see these beautiful grey sediments laminated with these thin white layers, that means that this was in the middle of the lake. So we have here high concentrations and good state of pollen, but when the lake did not exist any longer, so all the pollen was destroyed, and the lake level declined during the end of the late Bronze Age.
In sediment deep below the Sea of Galilee, Daphne uncovered the cause of the lake's disappearance. There, undisturbed pollen held evidence of a huge shock to plant life. Tree pollen had simply disappeared.
When we have high percentages of Mediterranean trees, such as pines, oaks, pistachio, and so on, probably we had high precipitation, humid climate conditions in our region. And vice versa, when we have a decline in the percentages of the arboreal pollen, that means that at this period of time we had drier climate conditions.
Could the apparent drop in rainfall have something to do with the turmoil described by Ramses? Archaeologist Israel Finkelstein is Professor Emeritus at Tel Aviv University. When he cross-referenced Daphne's data with his timeline, they coincided perfectly with the period when cities were destroyed right across Bronze Age Canaan.
The dry event at the end of the Bronze Age lasted from around 1250 BC until 1100 BC. This is what we see in the pollen investigation. Now we can shift to the archaeological evidence, the big wave of destructions in the region. It starts farther to the north of us, around 1250 BC. And finally here at Megiddo, in the time of Rameses III and a bit later.
When this new climate data landed on Eric Klein's desk, Eric realised it could revolutionise theories for the causes of the Bronze Age collapse.
When I had been working on my book and I had turned the book in, and I'm told the next thing you'll see is in 3 months it'll be out. About 3 days later, an article was published by Daphne Langgut, Israel Finkelstein, and Thomas Litt, which said that they had found evidence for a drought by taking samples in the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. This was brand new evidence, and it was so compelling that it basically catapulted drought, climate change, up to the top of the list. But it was too late. The book was in press. You can't change anything. And so I sent a frantic email to my editor, and I said, this article just came out. If we don't put it in, the book is going to be outdated even before it comes out. And I said in capital letters, stop the presses.
Eric's book was amended and went on to become a bestseller. What the Tel Aviv team had come up with was part of a wider revolution in the data available to archaeologists like Eric.
I went to conferences where geologists were presenting papers and where climate scientists were presenting papers. And they were talking about the late Bronze Age and evidence for drought and climate change and everything.
Detecting the presence of drought and famine in the archaeology is very difficult, though there were some clues hidden in the ancient texts that had survived down through the ages.
Certainly by 1200 BC, we get letters sent back and forth between the Hittite king and the Egyptian pharaoh saying, there's a drought, there's famine, I need food, help me out.
But the science now provided powerful evidence that these mentions of food shortages were in fact part of a much bigger picture. It was soon clear that evidence from across a huge geographical area was all pointing the same way as the data Daphne had gathered in Israel.
Other scholars who worked, for example, in Lake Van in Turkey and that worked in Syria and so on, they also noticed that drier climate conditions occurred based on their investigations, and it represents a climate crisis, not only in the southern Levant, based on the Dead Sea pollen and the Sea of Galilee pollen. It occurred in the entire Mediterranean region.
Lee Drake has been studying the impact of climate on farming through history. In regions that rely on rainfall instead of rivers, farming can be a precarious existence.
It's a very high-risk venture. You don't have a lot of tolerance for change. But at the end of the day, there's not much you can do if the rains don't come, or if they come too early, or if they come too late. Around 1250 BC, conditions were pretty good, whereas conditions in 1150 BC are bad and deteriorating quickly.
When drought hits several kingdoms at once, there may not be enough stored surplus to go round. Prolonged drought could lead to widespread famine.
Most people in the ancient world were farmers. We're talking almost 99% of the population. And so as a consequence, small changes in agricultural production have outsized impact on those societies.
What could cause the rains to fail across many kingdoms at once? Climate scientists have found a clue in the remains of ancient plankton extracted from the seabed of the Mediterranean. They suggest that it isn't warming, but cooling that is behind the increasing frequency of droughts.
We know the cooling happened because of the changes in warm species and cold species plankton. Some like warm water, some like cold water. You know, if you take a core and then you find that there's warm species here and cold species above it, that would tell you that there was a change in temperature that caused that transition from one species to another.
In a devastating chain of events, the Mediterranean's sudden cooling threw a switch in rainfall.
Colder sea surface temperatures mean less evaporation, and less evaporation means less precipitation, and less precipitation means poorer agricultural yields, and poorer agricultural yields mean hungrier people, and hungrier people means less stable societies.
The theories for what caused the sea to cool range from melting glaciers in the Alps to cold air pushing down from Siberia. But whatever triggered climate change, its effects could easily test relations between Bronze Age civilizations to breaking point.
If you go back to the Bronze Age, most people weren't living in places that had borders. You would plant crops, and if things went wrong, you would migrate and try a new strategy.
If you were a farmer, you would have been dramatically affected by the drought. If you had been a merchant, suddenly you might have found that the suppliers you had depended on, they had dried up because the trade between the royal courts of the different lands is going to come to an end. I think the king's going to be impacted, and therefore all the courtiers. And so I would pretty much guarantee that everyone was affected. The question was how and to what degree.
But there was still one key region where the case for serious drought was not proven.
There was a big missing part. We had the sea surface temperatures in the Mediterranean all over, from the Adriatic to the Levantine Basin, but we didn't have a record in Greece that recorded the changes that were happening.
But Martin Finney was about to find a major piece of the puzzle. At the University of Uppsala in Sweden, he is analysing samples of stalagmites that he has sourced from a cave in southern Greece.
There are a number of different ways of recovering information about the climate of the past. One way is using speleothems, cave stalagmites and cave stalactites, because they grow in a sheltered environment, so they can be preserved for a long time period. And when they are growing, they are recording information about the environment.
The growth of stalagmites changes according to what's happening in the environment around them. Like reading the rings in a tree trunk, they can tell us about the rainfall of the past.
So once you've collected your stalagmite from the cave, the first thing you need to do is cut it in half to reveal its inside, because that's what you're after. So this is the sort of the raw cutting surface. But then you go about polishing your sample. Already you can start seeing some of the structures or the layers. It's always exciting when you open it up and you start polishing it. Like you're the first one to see this for thousands of years, or like you're the only one.
Martin and his team struggled to fill a gap in their climate data. Until, in a cave on the tiny island of Skitsa, they found the key.
This stalagmite comes from Mavri-Tripa cave, which is located just off the southwest coast of the Peloponnese. And what's very interesting about this cave, and this stalagmite in particular, is that it has a very high level of uranium.
The uranium in the Mavri-Tripa stalagmites makes dating extremely precise. After working out exactly when each layer grew, further chemical analysis can reveal details about climate, rainfall, and evaporation rates. When Martin and his team zeroed in on the time of the Bronze Age collapse, they were astounded by what they saw.
The climate during the late Bronze Age has been a sort of hotly debated topic in this area. So this record really helps us sort of understand the climate. To me, this would indicate that we're going through like a 200-year period with sort of declining amounts of rainfall, which sort of then leads up to this even longer period of very dry conditions when we don't see any growth. And it probably stops growing because there's no water dripping anymore in the cave.
Martin's results confirm that this corner of Greece was also subject to repeated droughts over centuries. It's often impossible to nail down the precise chronology of events in the Bronze Age, so it's hard to be sure if drought took hold before or after the collapse. Greece was home to the Mycenean civilization, named after the important site of Mycenae. Every single major Mycenean centre was destroyed in the Bronze Age collapse, including one very close to the cave where Martin's stalactite came from, Pylos.
Here we can see the destruction of Pylos plotted onto this graph showing drier conditions. Having this really well-dated record from Mavri-Tripa cave allows us to compare the timing of the destruction of the palace with this climate information. And drier climate conditions has been suggested as being one factor in the destruction of the palace and its inability to recover again. This specimen was a chronological game changer.
I remember when I first met Martin Finet, and he said, we found it. We've got a speleothem record that shows the impact that this drought was indeed present at that time. It was a wonderful moment. First off, because he was excited, but also because when you're a scientist, what you want more than anything else isn't to be the person to discover something, but to have someone discover something that is consistent with how you've interpreted the data, right? It's not just you. Someone else is seeing what you're seeing or has found what you expected to find. And that was that moment for me personally when Martin Finet was able to find that record of drought at that time in Greece.
Every piece of new evidence about Mediterranean climate change brings its impact into ever sharper focus. A sudden cooling, the likes of which Bronze Age civilizations have never seen, heralds a drought that lasts for centuries.
The impact creates a rupture in Western civilization that we really don't see anywhere else in the old world. The complete collapse of multiple societies at the same times means that writing systems go extinct, languages go extinct. It's not just that this king is no longer king of the area. We see massive cultural patterns of change. So it creates a break in civilization's history that basically we start over again. It's like you hit the reset button on human civilization in the West.
A new dark age may have descended upon the kingdoms of the Bronze Age, but Egypt appears to have had the strength to endure. Even so, its most northerly possessions were in the land of Canaan. So how did Pharaoh combat the worst effects of climate change so far into drought-stricken territory? At the time of Ramses III, Megiddo was Egypt's stronghold in Canaan.
This place was absolutely important for the rule of the Egyptian empire over Canaan. And Megiddo is also sitting on the breadbasket of ancient Israel. As we can see behind us, we see the agricultural land, beautiful land of Megiddo, the Jezreel Valley. First of all, we definitely see intensification of cattle and cattle for the plow, which means cattle that was slaughtered at old age and therefore not for meat. We see this in a very interesting piece of information that comes from ancient DNA, and we can see introduction of zebu cattle, which is more resilient to climatic situations. So altogether, when you lump all these clues into one picture, there is reason to argue that the Egyptians, they understood that there is a problem. They located Megiddo as a place in the valley that can help overcome the problem. They extended dry farming here in order to supply grain to the marginal regions.
It looks as if Ramses was not just fighting off invaders, but fighting to hold Egypt's empire together too. The Egyptians were attempting to achieve some kind of food security in Canaan. Egypt did survive when so many other kingdoms and empires vanished from history, but the climate had not finished with Egypt. Mark Macklin is a fluviologist. His life's work is studying changing river systems through history. He thinks data from sediments left by the Nile suggests that Egypt's crucial food security was being attacked on yet another front. 3,000 miles from Egypt, Mark finds that a riverbank near his home in Wales is as good a place as any to explain how he can read the climate of the past.
It's reading these sediments which tells us about past rivers, past floods, and in some cases, past societies.
Mark collects buried sediments and examines them to see how long they've been left exposed on the surface in the past.
What we do is we insert a tube into the section, we take out the sample, we make sure it's not exposed to sunlight, and some of my very clever colleagues analyse and date these using a technique called optically stimulated luminescence. What that means in simple terms is that each of these sand grains acts a bit like a geological clock. So when they're being brought down by the river, deposited on the river bank, the sun comes down and the radioactive signal in them is bleached. It's emptied. And luminescence dating has revolutionised in the last 25 years or so. We were the first people to use it in the Nile Valley. What you can actually do is date the flood sediments itself and give it an exact age.
Mark and his colleagues extracted sediments from the Nile in the south of Ramses' kingdom. They reveal just how much the annual cycle that brought Nile floodwaters to Egypt could vary across the centuries. Seasonal monsoon rains falling on the distant highlands of Central Africa wash sediments down into the Nile. When the waters reach the plains, they spill out over the flat desert valleys. When the flood recedes, it leaves behind nutrients in the freshly soaked soil. This allows crops to flourish along the desert valley. But in the century before Ramses III, Egypt's annual flood is failing. The Nile only covers a few of the fields. What was once farmland is baked by the sun for years.
There appears to be a major channel drying, major channel contraction somewhere between 1280 and 1220 BC. And then much of the Nubian Nile runs dry.
Egypt's abundant food stores would have been eaten away year by year. With food becoming more scarce, records show that Ramses now had to deal with a new problem: civil unrest.
It's during Rameses III's reign that we have the first recorded industrial strike in history, where a group of workmen staged a sit-in in protest at not being paid their wages, and these were wages that were being paid by the authorities, by the crown. It's also the time when we have the earliest evidence for tomb robbery occurring on apparently a regular basis and becoming a real serious problem. And all of these things together give us a picture of a difficult time for Pharaoh.
A low Nile seems to be destabilising Egypt. But were these extended periods of drought a black swan event, a one-off that no one could see coming? Or were they part of a bigger pattern? Ancient records hold evidence of similar events in Egypt 1,000 years before Ramses.
4,200 years ago, the so-called 4.2 Ka event, there is a major documented drought recorded in Egypt. And this records major changes in flow. And actually one of the stories which is told is that people could actually walk across the Nile because it had dried up.
This previous drought could have spelled the end of the line for the era of the pyramid-building kings of Old Kingdom Egypt. Research by Mark and other scientists is revealing more of these rapid climate change events. Although thousands of years apart, they coincide with major shifts in human history.
Rapid climate change events last for several centuries, and they tend to be characterised by colder periods at the poles and greater aridity in the equator. And there are a number of these.
Mark estimates that the climate change events that impacted Ramses could have lasted almost 500 years, and it was driven by forces no pharaoh had the power to control.
The major primary control of climate during these periods appears to be weakening in the strength of the sun. But also there may have been changes in volcanic activity, which could have been important as well.
These planetary cycles can not only change rainfall across the Mediterranean, they're powerful enough to impact the African monsoon on which the Nile itself depends. Ramses III's reign is challenged both by nature and the human consequences of these events. Israel Finkelstein believes that it's time to rethink Ramses' characterizations of the Sea Peoples as an invasion force bent on destruction. The first wave of violence was followed by a more subtle but more profound change.
The movement of the Sea People should be seen in relation to the droughts and famine in this region. We used to speak about the movement of the Sea People imagining something that happened similar to the invasion of Normandy in Second World War. We know today that this was not the situation. We do not speak about thousands of people attacking the coast of Canaan. We are speaking about groups who came with several ships here and there and settled along the coast in several places. And the Egyptians then describe it in a typical propaganda version of Rameses III, that he was the great king who managed to stop them and prevent them from invading the territory of Egypt and fighting them and so on and so forth.
The Sea Peoples have been characterised as warlike, opportunistic invaders by Ramses' propaganda. Thanks to new scientific discoveries, historians now have a chance to take a more nuanced view of who they were and what they wanted.
What did the Sea Peoples want? They wanted what every other migrating people wants. They are in search of a better life. We've seen migrations like this throughout history. Look, even now, at all of the Syrians fleeing the civil war. Right? When you've got migrations, you usually have a push factor, civil war, drought, and then you've got a pull factor, either better land, more crops, no drought, or whatever. So what did the Sea Peoples want? They wanted what any other peoples that are migrating want. They want a fresh start.
But with problems at home and with constant troubles abroad, Egypt pulls out of Canaan completely, possibly before the end of Ramses' reign. Megiddo, the Canaanite city that gave Armageddon its name. Here, Israel Finkelstein has discovered evidence that makes its final days a perfect symbol of the end of civilization.
We are now standing at the gate of Megiddo behind me. What we basically see here is the palace put to the torch, the gate as well. And when we excavated at the gate, we found evidence for the last moments, for the final days of Bronze Age Megiddo.
Israel's uncovered a highly unusual sight. Ovens added right by the city gate. This was no longer a bustling centre of commerce. This was a city under siege.
Ovens which were constructed within the gate, which means the gate was blocked and people lived inside. And people from the countryside, probably at a certain moment, had to leave, had to run away from their villages. They came into the main city hoping to find refuge. The city was overcrowded and people really settled everywhere, including in places that usually people leave vacant, such as the city gate leading to the palace.
But Megiddo turned out to be less of a refuge, more of a target.
Several hundred people, well equipped and desperate, can come to a place like this at night and put it to the torch.
A city put to the torch is a shocking emblem of the end of civilization. The aftershocks, both violent and peaceful, would be felt for generations as climate change sets whole populations in motion. Egypt's glory, too, is waning. Ramses III's reign was not to end well.
There are a series of documents from the end of Ramses III's reign which seem to show that there was a conspiracy to have the king murdered. And this was perpetrated by one of his wives, apparently in league with one or two others. For this reason, it's become known as the Harem conspiracy. And the motivation for this seems to have been the desire on the part of the wives to install a particular son of Ramses III as his successor, against his wishes. And it may be that this might also reflect some of the wider challenges that were experienced in Egypt during Ramses III's reign. With all of the invasions going on and economic difficulties, he would have had some very difficult decisions to make, and it may be that his handling of the situation wasn't very popular. And by the end of the reign, there were more than one faction involved, and the Harem conspiracy is the result of one of those factions trying to force the issue.
The pharaoh who had saved Egypt while the world collapsed all around him would ultimately fall to an assassin from the very heart of his own court. The collapse of Bronze Age civilizations left a darkness lasting centuries. But from the ashes, new societies eventually began to form. Behind this story of the end of civilization as we knew it is another uncomfortable truth, that humans are at the mercy of nature.
There's a narcissism that we project onto the study of archaeology, and I mean this sincerely, even though I suspect I'll get a little bit of flack for it. We don't like to live in a world where a subtle change in sea surface temperatures can undo multiple civilizations in one go. But that distinction between the natural and the artificial has never been there. The climatological records of the past and the changes that happened in climate directly affected humans. Whether we like it or not, we're in it with the trees, the deer, and all that.
One could say that we're focused now on climate change as being a big part of the collapse, only because climate change is so big in our world today. Climate change absolutely was a factor back then. There is no denying it. If anything, it's because we have problems today and are so aware of it that we are becoming more aware of it back then.
Up now, we uncover the sacrifices leadership were willing to make to cover up the explosion. In New Chernobyl, the new evidence. Or over on SBS Food, feed your stomach and your soul in Rick Stein's Far Eastern Odyssey.